It's a bit difficult to just jump to the program, but I'll just start with my talk because there's little time. Thank you very much for inviting me here to this very inspiring conference. In my paper, I'd like to discuss the export of Soviet urbanist strategies, knowledge and institutions to the so-called developing world in the 1960s, more specifically to the Afghan capital, Kabul. From the first 1964 General Plan for Development of Kabul, drafted by Soviet planners, to the creation of modern microrayon housing districts, to capacity building projects like the Soviet-sponsored Kabul Polytechnic Institute. I'd just thus like to address how the project of building the Soviet city acquired global reach, as the USSR intensified its worldwide involvement in development cooperation from the mid-50s onwards. Since then, so from the mid-50s onwards, Afghanistan became a hotspot of competitive technical assistance initiatives due to its geostrategic importance in the global Cold War. Much in contrast to the terrible future in store, the country was perceived at the time to benefit from peaceful coexistence and competition in development aid, materialized most prominently in the urban landscape of Kabul. And of course, it's impossible not to touch upon the painful and loaded question of the legacies of Soviet involvement in Afghanistan. Most authors writing since 1979 seek to explain in the first place this tragic outcome of Afghan and Soviet relation. But recent scholarship underlines that there's actually quite good reason to assume that the USSR did pursue long-term interests in peaceful cooperation, while the disastrous military intervention resulted from a political shortcut in the context of the Iranian Revolution and NATO double-track decisions. So for the purposes of this paper, Soviet town planning and building projects in the 60s are understood as a yet open-ended modernization endeavor, without denying the heavy-handed paternalism of the development idea upon which this endeavor was based, and which ultimately came to justify a brutal war. Soviet involvement in the production of urban space in Kabul in the 60s is as part of a history of post-colonial and pre-invasion efforts to wield political and economic influence through technical assistance in one of the many theaters of the global Cold War. But at the same time, I think it can also be read as a case study in the cultural construction of modern urban space as a global desire, promoted by the politics and practices of competitive coexistence, acted out in multilateral processes of knowledge transfer and negotiation with a high degree of Afghan agency. So, where do we start? Right? In the early 60s, Soviet architects at the Central Scientific Research and Project Institute for Town Planning in Moscow drew up the first general plan for development of the city of Kabul. How did this come about? Like in other Afghan towns and cities, building had previously proceeded overwhelmingly according to community-organized settlement patterns, and with large-scale interventions according to the King's decision enacted by the city government, as you can see in this aerial of 1960. In the late 50s, United Nations development consultants launched the idea that a general plan would be needed to deal with intensifying urbanization, and set French architect Roger Aujam, a former collaborator of Le Corbusier and former Siam activist, to Kabul to work out ideas. At the same time, development cooperation between the USSR and Afghanistan was on the rise since Khrushchev's first $100 million credit of 55, followed by more and more credits invested in highly visible infrastructure projects, the asphalt paving of Kabul's roads, factories, technical schools, highways, earning Soviet technicians a good reputation for getting results in time, technically respectable, and without frills. Opposed to more expensive and rather ill-famed United States projects at the same time. In 1962, the Soviet and Afghan governments concluded a contract on technical assistance in town planning and housing with a credit volume of about 80 million United States dollar. It included not only the commission to draft a general plan, but also to set up a demonstrativny kombinat and the planning and construction of 2 new neighborhoods for more than 10,000 people. With this investment, the Afghan Ministry of Public Works wanted to introduce type projects for European-style housing and to counter the dominance of Hochtief from West Germany and other Western construction firms who at the time practically dictated, so quote, prices in the non-traditional construction sector, as representatives of Soviet Gazstroy were informed by their Afghan negotiation partners. The Afghan clients also requested that the Domostроительный комбинат was adapted to turn out not only elements for one type of four-story apartment block, but also for a catalogue of modern urban detached houses and bungalows with 4 to 12 rooms for private purchase. In designing these new bungalow types or townhouses and engineering the prefabrication of construction elements for them, the Soviet project organization really went out of its way to show its technical equality with international competitors. After all, the USSR planners were trying to sell a vision of modern urbanism and architecture to a paying client. After the deal was made, work on the general plan for Kabul over a 25-year period until 1989 was assigned to a Soviet planning team, first at Gostroy Projekt, then at the Central Scientific Research and Project Institute for Town Planning, Tsniprada. From 1962 to 1964, the planners worked in very close collaboration with Kabul city architect Siraj and his staff at the Municipal Planning Office, departing from prior work by the French planner, Ojam, whom the Afghans had sent to the provinces. However anxious and closely monitored these encounters might have been, working on the general plan did open up a space of interaction and negotiation between Soviet planners, their Afghan and international counterparts. In late 1964, the final document was presented to the Afghan authority. There's quite sparse documentation of this document. It's not available at the Snipgrado archive. What I know about it now is not. There's clearly much more to be studied about this general plan. But from what I've been able to find, the plan was founded on basic modernist urbanist principles, of course. Overall zoning according to function, a differentiated road network outfitting the city for automobilization, an up-to-date network of infrastructures, the introduction of public parks, and separate spaces for pedestrian circulation. It proposed to tear down much of the traditional building stock and mixed-use, the existing mixed-use neighborhood that were deemed too dense and unhygienic. In fact, 70% of Kabul was to be torn down according to the general plan. Instead, new housing districts of 25 to 30,000 inhabitants each were projected based on a unified system for the distribution of social amenities, departing from the microrayon as a structural unit. Here you can see these, the residential districts and the sub-centers that the general plan provided. Centers for sports, research, higher and professional educations were to be distributed across the city, while monofunctional industrial areas and markets were placed on the periphery, on the main roads. The economic growth of Kabul was projected not on an industrial base, but mostly in the tertiary sector, government and administration, trade, culture, and services. And as a consequence, the plan envisioned a radical reconstruction of the city center as the place where most places of work would be concentrated. And here are some of the models that show the architectural or the urban design vision behind it. Next to the King's Palace, government buildings were to be arranged in freestanding slabs and towers around the main square of the city and along the central axis of Prospect Pashtunistan. Across the river, where the old bazaar quarter would have to be razed to the ground, several stretched-out building complexes of megastructure dimension were to provide a totally reconstructed center for business and culture. This is here, this part. You can not see so well this area here. Even its schematic outline shows to what extent the plan reflects on international architectural debates of the early 60s. From the material available, it's difficult to attribute individual features of the plan with absolute certainty to the Soviet collective, the French, or the Afghan experts. Indeed, there were conflicting claims for authorship, underscoring the compatibility, if not even exchangeability, of town planning visions and visions of urban modernity advocated by stakeholders and experts from South, East, and West at this point in time. And it would be really mistaken to read them purely as a foreign prescription. The impetus of the Afghan upper class and young technical elite in promoting Western-style modernization ought not to be underestimated, especially the desire to see Kabul transformed and to see traditional building and winding alleys replaced by modern architecture and urban spaces. What were the effects of the '64 General Plan? Its assessment by Afghan and international scholars is contradictory, to say the least. And I'm actually quite cautious to claim a true story of the role of the General Plan in Afghan urban politics at this point in time for the next 15 years. Because some scholars from Afghanistan assert that the Soviet Masterplan was not even officially approved until a communist government came to power in Kabul in '79. Indeed, the General Plan was revised at least 2 times during the '70s in collaboration with Soviet and international consultants. Yet other sources from Afghanistan report that there was an immediate and marked influence on the city and that the General Plan was really a milestone in institutional development. And certain elements of the plan were put into practice straight away, in line with the technical aid contract. Oh, here's another sketch of the center showing some of the elements I just described. In 1965, the construction of Kabul's first microrayon neighborhood began. 60 housing blocks and small sub-centers of shops, services, and social facilities. Its 4-story apartment type blocks were prefabricated by the Domostроительный Kombinat, approximately 2,200 dwelling units, for sale, not for rent. Soviet architects and engineers detailed to Kabul to supervise building worked very hard against many obstacles to get the neighborhood completed by the beginning of the '70s, including most of the amenities provided for. Microrayon number one, I'm sorry. Introduced a specific typology of collective housing catering to a modern core family and provided public services and generous public spaces open to collective use, kicking off the progressive transformation of urban lifestyle at micro level. Its specific meaning in the context of in the social and urban fabric of Kabul can only be hinted at briefly here. Initially, it failed to attract solvent Kabuli buyers with the desire to live in a Soviet-style modern small family apartment. In the '70s, Afghan government servant and leftist Kabul intellectuals of some means moved in to become neighbors to Soviet technical advisors and their families. And the microrayon is located, wait, I can't hardly see it. Here. Seen in the general context of urban development strategies, the microrayon's first priority realization, followed by several more such neighborhoods, resonates with the importance of this type of housing estate as the arguably most significant feature of Soviet urbanist practice of the time, overshadowing the impact of the replanning of the city center by far. Indeed, only small patches of new representative government or business center were realized with the first 14-story office tower and demolitions of old quarters in the 1970s, before war interrupted. In spite of the General Plan's disputed status and fragmentary implementation, its existence and subsequent revisions meant that the practice of modern town planning was taking hold in Afghanistan. In the mid-60s, a central authority for town planning and housing was established in Kabul, with United States assistance and a multinational expert and volunteer staff, and conspicuously few Soviet experts in this staff. It was updating the planning for the capital and preparing master plans for other larger urban centers of the country, even if, quote, by its director, a general lack of relevant information has made this task extremely difficult. In addition, the central authority was responsible for running the Soviet export prefabrication plant, as well as several owner-built low-cost housing projects. This meant, under its roof, diametrically opposed solutions to the housing problem coexisted. Soviet-equipped maximally industrialized construction and alternative approaches to provide affordable dwellings. And in the end, it might be just a telling coincidence, but the central authority's offices came to be located in a converted housing block of the first Kabul microrayon. This spatial adaptation, I think, is very befitting for an institution whose work seems to have been characterized by improvising multiple modernization strategies and making do in absence of many essential prerequisites of modern-style urban planning. So I've already moved from plans and physical interventions in the urban space to the institutional framework. According to US scholars Robinson and Dixon, Soviet economists and development policy advisors displayed a more thorough and earlier understanding of the significance of institution and capacity building than many development experts, unquote, from the capitalist world at the time. They conclude that Soviet technical assistance provided to Afghanistan was generally meant to trigger independent development. My reading of the 1960s Soviet technical assistance in the field of architecture and urbanism supports this argument to some extent, but at the same time it clearly emerges that a hierarchical center-periphery relation was established. The Soviet town planning and housing projects in Kabul embodied transfers of knowledge and technology on many levels. Soviet experts undertook geological, social, and economic surveys to establish a database for planning. They suggested how to organize settlement based on the latest urbanist principles employed in the USSR by means of prefabricated collective housing in a modern urban layout. With the export of the Demonstrativny Kombinat, also the matching industrial technology was handed over to be run by the Afghan state. Financed by the Soviet loan, and an example was set for a state-financed housing system. And thousands of Afghan staff were trained by and worked with Soviet engineers and foremen. Last but not least, a higher education facility for construction engineering and other technical professions following the Soviet model and sponsored by the USSR was created, the Kabul Polytechnic Institute. It integrated the city into a global network of higher education, which was pegged on Moscow. The campus of the 60-hectare landscaped ground was designed by Gipravus team and built in 63 to 69. It's, I'd say, straightforward Soviet modernism, from the clear-cut facades of the main buildings to the large, fully glazed rotunda of the cafeteria and a huge, edifying mosaic, a natural stone, set above the sports center at the head of the main promontory. Three-story dormitory blocks were constructed in prefabricated concrete elements above the structured by loggias and brise-soleil elements in simple geometric patterns that are on the bottom left. Urban legend has it that from bird's eye perspective, or from the nearby Kabul Hilton set on a hilltop, the urban layout of the Polytechnic was shaped, in the letters SSSR, but you have to look very closely to see SSSR. And this is the library building, so this is supposed to be the overhead of Soviet knowledge. Of course, a bomb was destroyed this very soon when the Taliban moved in. But we don't know if that was the intention. For the Kabul Polytechnic, it's more important, I think, that the USSR did not just provide the turnkey architecture, teaching equipment, and the library, and its contents, but most know-how and manpower needed for a higher learning institution. In short, a complete institutional ready-made was exported and successfully set to function in a foreign context. At the same time, it figured as a landmark architecture and very important political space in Kabul and in Afghanistan as large. It also must be noted that the Polytechnic was established in direct concurrence to US-sponsored higher technical education. This is the engineering faculty of the Kabul University, founded with US aid money. A new campus had been built with US assistance in 1964, and an architecture program was established there in 1967. And at the same time, the Kabul Polytechnic was one of several or many higher technical and engineering schools sponsored and built by the Soviet Union in so-called developing countries around the globe in the 60s, often designed by Guy Plavou's team. For example, the Hanoi Polytechnic for 2,400 students, the Technological Institute of Rangoon, of which I don't have a picture here, but other examples include the Polytechnical Institute of Conakry, Guinea, the Institute of Oil and Gas in Algiers, etc. These gifts created not only landmark architectures in the respective cities and countries, but also an important network, global network of similar higher education institutions modeled on Soviet practice and expertise. And they, I think, are an extremely interesting field of future research. This network, pegged on Moscow, is of course, I forgot to mention that, of course, at the Druzhba Narodov here in Moscow, one author of the Kabul General Plan headed the planning department in the 1970s, where he published, for example, this textbook, Town Planning in Hot Climates, drawing on the experience of planning and building in Kabul in 1972 and 76. In addition, this network was complemented by other mechanisms to exchange urbanist knowledge, for example, internships or graduate studies, and expert seminars on urban planning techniques held for specialists from developing countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America in Moscow on behalf of the United Nations Center for Housing, Building, and Planning in 1964 or in 1966, organized by the Central Scientific Research Institute of Town Planning. I'm not sure how I am with time. I think, okay. So, because I was worried my abstract would be a bit too optimistic. So I'm going to go into how such a seminar looked like. A week of lecture sessions by Soviet specialists was followed by a study tour to Volgograd, Tashkent, Samarkand, Tbilisi, and Sochi, ranging from Stalinist post-war reconstruction schemes to recent examples of functionalist neighborhood planning and industrialized housing construction after the 1966 earthquake in Tashkent, and finished at the most modern holiday facilities at Pitsunda in the Black Sea. The recommendations of the working groups had been prepared in advance by the Soviet expert presiding the sessions and were accepted, as the internal report of Znipgrada says, without significant changes. The internal report on the seminar says disappointingly little about the professional exchange on actual planning questions during the seminar, but focused more on the relations with participants from different countries. Political discussions were nervously anticipated because the seminar took place very close after the invasion of Czechoslovakia, and the fact that no serious political debate or difference of opinion whatsoever arose at the seminar, as a quote, was taken as a proof for the serious interest of the seminar participants to learn about the Soviet approach. The internal report concludes, the experience of this seminar shows that this type of meeting is not only an opportunity to demonstrate the successes of the Soviet Union to representatives of developing countries, but also to establish working relations with executives of the United Nations Secretary, as well as leading specialists of different countries, which proves a good way to strengthen our influence in these countries. So, gatherings like these were instrumental in the making of an international expert community of planners, clearly not equals, as the setup defined a client-student relation for recipients on the one hand in need of knowledge and development aid versus potential donors and teachers. The seminars stabilized claims for Soviet technical superiority and urban development expertise on the international plane, and were evaluated by the Soviet part as a chance to get lucrative commissions abroad. At the same time, I'd also like to suggest that the prestigious assignment to broker Soviet expertise to an international audience stabilized the claims of the host institution, the Central Scientific Research Institute for Town Planning in Moscow, to steer urbanization with the Soviet Union itself. In fact, the materials of the seminar were recycled for a similar seminar for Soviet city architects taking place within 3 weeks of the seminar, only they didn't get the lavish treatment to go to Pitsunda afterwards. And this relation between Soviet experts and experts from the developing countries is, I think it's quite tellingly visualized on the pages of this journal, Asia и Africa Сегодня, which on the one hand has this very independent-looking lady on the cover, but the photograph illustrating the Soviet engineer working with the third world, in this case Egyptian worker, clearly shows us how this relation was imagineered, let's say. The contrast between the heroism and the, well, not quite equal friendship. So we're entering very complicated questions of hierarchies, and I think what also would be an important question to pursue here, but this would also need further research, is the question of hubs of international knowledge exchange in the southern republics, namely Tbilisi, Tashkent, the kind of work that was done at the institutes there, the people who came there, the international exchanges, etc. I'm not sure if anybody here has a better knowledge of this, but I think this would be a hugely interesting field. I would like to jump back to Kabul and the question of legacies very briefly. In February 2012, the New York Times online edition featured a slideshow about Kabul entitled "From Soviet Past, Only Architecture Remains," mostly photographs of apparently deserted and decaying buildings assembled to show the, quote, otherworldliness of Soviet modernism now in ruins, quote, sobering artifacts that confront the United States and its allies as they begin pondering what their own legacy might be, end of quote. Yet to some Kabul residents quoted in the same context, there was more to the built legacy of Afghan and Soviet development cooperation. For example, regarding the mikrorayon housing districts, where the New York Times journalist sees, quote, gray apartment blocks bearing the bullet and shell marks, cramped, rundown, and patchy, end of quote. A resident, a school principal, describes a safe place with running water, electricity, and central heating, and calls it a great work for Afghanistan, done by the Russians. Another resident's report, a bit earlier, of 2007, concludes, it is very regrettable that such a valuable project has never been repeated, and there is no plan to build similar housing units. I think that the government should have a program to support similar housing projects and continue building apartments to distribute among those who need them most. The mikrorayons had become part of the war after '79. Soviet officers were quartered there, barbed wire closed off the open public spaces, and attacks were waged against their inhabitants. Yet, the Domostроительный Kombinat continued to produce new apartment blocks up to the Soviet withdrawal, indeed until '92. Since then, it was partially destroyed, and to my knowledge, has not been said to function again, in spite of that there's been talk and news about a Russian investment in its resurrection. And maybe, I don't know, if I've missed some news that this actually came to fruition lately. But the mikrorayons are renovated today and seem to have gained popularity again as a decent and affordable housing, as an embodiment of the memories of the hopeful 70s, shared of present and past residents, who even set up a virtual community of a Facebook group, the first mikrorayon, and also as a model of strictly planned urbanization. In spite of all its shortcomings, I think the debate is still open whether to condemn this modernization pathway as utterly failed, or whether the legacy of the modern Masterplan, general plan, is still preferable to the disrupted island urbanism by warlords, different international agencies, and whoever is trying to stake a claim in present-day Kabul in a war-torn urban setting. I'll stop here, quite short of the many things that are still in need to be studied and said about this facet of the long but not necessarily happy life of the Soviet city. Thank you very much.
A small question. Did the Soviets train Afghan architects? How has this policy left traces in the architectural and planning profession in Afghanistan? People who came to schools in Moscow or elsewhere, or who worked with the Soviet specialists. Any idea?
Yes, they did. They did train Afghan architects and planners. In fact, most people who were professional architects and planners in the 60s and 70s were educated either in France, in Germany, in the USA, or in the Soviet Union, or sometimes even in many of those places. So they were very well versed in international architectural debates because they had a lot of insight, let's say. And they picked what they could realize with the conditions on the ground that were very difficult. And I think they clearly followed this modernist development idea that was advocated with the clear knowledge that it was very difficult and that lots of improvisation was needed. In the 1980s, I mean, there were Afghan students at Mathi, there were groups of Mathi students who worked together with students from Kabul on designing kind of new housing for Kabul, which would take account of the climatic and cultural conditions in the 1980s, but that never came to realization. But they're quite interesting projects. Some of them, yeah. But yeah, I think it would be worth talking to more of those people and trying to find out whether some of the ideas might still have some impetus. Yeah.
Okay. Is this on? Yes. Thank you for that. I had a small question again about the housing blocks that were built from the Domostроительный комбинат in Afghanistan. Where were they getting the housing types? Were they, types developed in Moscow? Were the types developed in Moscow for, southern climates? I mean, because you said there was some resistance to moving into these apartment blocks. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more about those kind of more Soviet-looking units as opposed to the bungalows that were developed?
The apartment blocks were developed based on the Soviet series 1464, and they were adapted to have bigger apartments because Afghan families tended to be bigger and need more sleeping rooms. So there would be some. I'm sorry, I think I didn't bring the layout of these apartment blocks. So and they, I think they switched in such a way that sleeping rooms and the living room would be separated in a different way in accordance to different way to. Different ideas of privacy, and this was clearly put into the discussion also by the Afghan architects who worked with Soviet designers on these projects, who also clearly expressed their opinions for the design of the bungalows. Still, there were 2 meter 55 ceilings, panel construction. In Afghan climate, совместный санузел, things that took a modernist mind, let's say, if you used to a really completely different lifestyle, and also the tradition of living as a core family is something that was just, well, it wasn't a tradition, but it was just a new practice. And as that was taking hold, more and more people did actually move into these apartments. if they came from the provinces, had studied in Kabul, founded a family there, then this kind of apartment would be just the right thing. But if you came from a big Kabul family, you wouldn't think of moving to this kind of small apartment. So it's really also a question of lifestyle, of an urban lifestyle changing. Also, for example, childcare. There was a kindergarten, but much less places for kindergarten childcare were provided in this Kabul microrayon than the Soviet norms would be, because it was expected that nobody would send their children to kindergarten at this early age, and the Soviet architects called the design for the kindergarten really experimental, because that was something new in Afghan conditions at the time, and they didn't even know how it would be, taken on and practiced. Yeah.
Thank you very much. But there is any sign of, do you find signs, traces of the Yugoslavia, experts from Yugoslavia at the time? You quote, there were Yugoslavian architects or planners at the time in Kabul or in Afghanistan?
Well, I found some traces of Bulgarian specialists and Japanese.
No Yugoslavian.
But the Yugoslav planner I haven't really come across. Was that during the 70s or in the 60s already?
Yes.
Because I know in the 70s the teams were very international. And but for the 60s general plan, it was only a Soviet. For the 64 plan, it was a Soviet Afghan collaboration consulted by Ujam.
Thank you.
Thank you. What was impressing in your speech is that the fact that it's a really short chronological distance, which detaches the first microrayon, experimentalny microrayon housing block in Novy Черемушки, 56, from the beginning of the export of this model in Afghanistan in the 60s. So in the planning of microrayons in Russia, in the Soviet Union, some sociological and demographical researches were made in order to establish the family structures. And it was established that 3 and 4 member families are statistically the most expanded in the Soviet Union, and the idea of the mass standardized construction was built on this research. I wonder if you know there were some researches of the structure of Afghan families, or it was just an import of the model of modernist Soviet family in Afghanistan.
I know that the work on the general plan was being done. When Soviet planners started to work on the general plan, they realized that population data, and any kind of statistic in Afghanistan at the time were extremely scarce and unreliable, because not even census. They didn't even have a proper census for most of the cities, because the whole idea of making a census was alien to much of the population. You wouldn't say how many women, children, etc. were living in a particular compound or neighborhood, especially in the more traditional villages. So Soviet planners started from scratch, but I mean they were also assisted by the work by the United Nations, who also thought that it was necessary to compile all those data, but much of it, and they also admitted, was really approximation. And this is also clearly stated in the preface to the general plan, that this is a kind of a schematic preliminary proposal, and that it cannot be claimed that it's really based on such sound premises. So they were pretty aware of the difficulty. For example, they also used the Soviet building norms and standards, because there were no building norms and standards in Afghanistan. There wasn't such a document. The whole legislative and normative part of building and planning was just under construction, literally. Yeah.